Shortly after my grandparents passed away, my parents showed up claiming they owned the house and told me to leave, but I had already secured the entire estate in a trust and said not gonna happen. I'm 28 years old, and I never thought I'd be fighting my own blood over what my grandparents built. The moment I graduated with my accounting degree, my very first priority was making sure their $3 million estate was locked down tight in a trust. Why? Because I'd been watching the vultures circle for years, and those vultures were my parents and my sister. To really understand why I went to such lengths, you need the full backstory. This isn't just about money or property. This is about 2 decades of manipulation, entitlement, and watching people who were supposed to be family treat the kindest souls I ever knew like walking bank accounts. So buckle up, because this gets messy. My grandparents Frank and Dorothy Bennett raised me from age 5. My biological parents Gerald and Patricia basically dropped me off at their doorstep to chase big careers in another state. But honestly, what they were really chasing was a life free from responsibility, bouncing between one get-rich scheme after another. Every single one crashed and burned spectacularly. I still remember that day they left me. I was 5 years old, standing in my grandparents' driveway with a small suitcase and my stuffed bear. Mom was crying these fake tears while Dad kept checking his watch. It's just temporary, they kept saying. Just until we get settled in our new jobs. Those new jobs were selling some miracle water filtration system that turned out to be a pyramid scheme. They lost everything within 6 months. But by then I was already settled with Frank and Dorothy, already calling them Grandma and Grandpa, already feeling more at home than I ever had with my biological parents. My childhood home wasn't just any house. It was this gorgeous Victorian in a historic Philadelphia neighborhood built in 1887 with original woodwork, stained glass windows, and a wraparound porch that creaked in all the right places. The house had been in Grandpa Frank's family for 3 generations. His grandfather had been a successful merchant who'd built it for his growing family. And it had passed down through the years, each generation adding their own touches while respecting the original character. And it wasn't just the house. There were 3 rental properties. My grandparents owned a duplex in West Philadelphia and 2 row homes in South Philly. Grandpa had bought them back in the 1970s when real estate was affordable, fixed them up himself, and rented them to working families at reasonable rates. He wasn't trying to get rich off tenants. He just wanted steady income and to provide decent housing. Those properties alone were worth about $800,000. Then there were the investments. Grandpa Frank had worked for 42 years as an accountant at a steel company, living modestly and saving aggressively. He'd put money into index funds, municipal bonds, and blue-chip stocks. Nothing flashy, nothing risky. Just solid, steady growth over decades. By the time I came to live with them, their investment portfolio was worth close to $1 million. Altogether, the estate was worth around $3 million. No small change. But for me, it was never about the money. That house was home. It was where I learned what real family actually felt like. Every morning, I'd wake up to the smell of Grandma Dorothy's fresh-baked muffins, blueberry on Mondays, chocolate chip on Fridays, and banana nut on Wednesdays. She had a whole rotation system. Rise and shine, little numbers guy she'd call out from the kitchen long before I even dreamed of becoming an accountant. The nickname started when I was 7 and spent an entire afternoon sorting my baseball cards by statistics instead of playing outside. Grandpa Frank taught me how to fish at the local park with endless patience. Even when I kept tangling my line or dropping the bait bucket into the water, he'd just laugh, untangle everything, and show me again. Patience, Tyler. He'd say, "Good things come to those who wait." Fish job's the right person to spend your life with. Rushing never helps. In the evenings, we'd sit in the library, and yes, they had an actual library, a whole room lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves that Grandpa had built himself. Each of us would have our own book, and we'd read in comfortable silence, occasionally sharing passages that caught our eye. Grandpa loved historical biographies. Grandma preferred mysteries. I worked my way through everything from Hardy Boys to eventually financial journals. Sunday mornings were sacred. Grandma would make this elaborate breakfast: eggs, bacon, homemade biscuits, fresh fruit salad. We'd sit around the dining room table for hours talking about everything. Current events, history, what I was learning in school. They treated me like an equal, never talking down to me, always interested in my opinions, even when I was just a kid. From them, I learned the values that shaped my entire life: honesty, hard work, responsibility, integrity. Grandpa always said, "Your word is your bond, Tyler. Break it, and you lose something you can never buy back." He lived by that principle. If he told a tenant he'd fix something, it got fixed. If he promised me we'd go fishing Saturday, we went fishing Saturday. Rain or shine. Grandma always pushed for education and independence. A person must be able to stand on their own 2 feet. She'd say usually while teaching me how to cook or balance a checkbook or change a tire, especially when others try to knock them down. She'd grown up during the Depression, seen her own family lose everything, and was determined I'd have the skills to survive anything life threw at me. Little did I know how prophetic those words would turn out to be. My relationship with my biological parents and my younger sister Lindsay was complicated at best. Actually, complicated is too generous. It was basically non-existent, except when they wanted something. They'd show up maybe twice a year, usually around Christmas when gifts were expected, or randomly when they needed cash. I learned to recognize the pattern. Dad would call a few days ahead, suddenly interested in how I was doing, asking about school, acting like a real father. Then they'd arrive with these big smiles and elaborate stories about whatever venture they were involved in. Now every visit followed the same tired script. First came the over-the-top affection hugs that lasted too long. Compliments that rang hollow, questions about my life that they didn't actually want answers to. Then casual observations about how big the house was, how much the neighborhood must have appreciated subtle mentions of Grandpa's investments. This would culminate in some teary story about unexpected expenses. The car broke down, medical bills from some mysterious ailment, an investment opportunity that just needed a little capital to take off, business expenses that insurance didn't cover. Always something, always urgent, always requiring money right now. And the requests for loans, they were never repaid, not once in 23 years. I remember one particular Christmas when I was 12. Dad spent the entire visit talking to Grandpa about his latest scheme, selling prepaid legal services door to door. He needed $5,000 to buy his territory and get started. "This is it, Pop," he kept saying. "This is the one that's going to make us rich." Grandpa gave him $3,000. By March, the company had been shut down by the state attorney general for fraud. Dad never mentioned paying Grandpa back. When I asked about it years later, Grandpa just shook his head. Some lessons cost money to learn. I learned my son isn't good with either responsibility or money. Dad had filed for bankruptcy twice before I turned 10. Once when I was 6, once when I was 9. Both times, my grandparents found out only when creditors started calling their house looking for him. He'd used their address for various business ventures without asking. Mom was involved in everything from miracle diet pills to sham timeshares to essential oils to discount vacation memberships. She'd call Grandma breathlessly excited about each new opportunity, talking about 6-figure incomes and early retirement. 3 months later, she'd be crying about how the company had scammed her, how she'd lost money, how they needed help getting back on their feet. They lived way beyond their means, always chasing that one big opportunity that would finally make them rich. Dad drove a leased Mercedes he couldn't afford. Mom wore designer clothes bought on credit cards they couldn't pay off. They rented a townhouse in a fancy neighborhood and told people they owned it. My sister Lindsay, 7 years younger than me, grew up watching them and learning every manipulative trick in the book. By her teens, she was a master of entitlement, combining their worst traits into one nightmare package. I remember this one incident when she was 14 and I was 21, home from college for Thanksgiving. Grandma had these antique brews her mother had given her, beautiful pieces from the 1920s. Not worth a fortune, but priceless and sentimental value. Lindsay stole 3 of them during dinner, pawned them the next day for $200, and used the money to buy concert tickets. When Grandma noticed they were missing and asked about it, Lindsay cried and said she'd seen me looking at them, implying I'd taken them. My parents immediately blamed me. Didn't even question her. Only when the pawn shop called Lindsay had been dumb enough to use Grandma's name. Did the truth come out? My parents' response: "She's just a teenager. They make mistakes." At least she didn't break them. Another time, Lindsay used Grandpa's credit card number, which she'd memorized from seeing it lying around, to buy $1,500 worth of clothes online. When the bill came, she claimed she thought it was okay, because family shares things. Mom defended her, saying we should be teaching her financial responsibility, not punishing her for confusion. Grandpa paid the bill. He always paid, but I could see it wearing on him. The disappointment that his own son had raised such a manipulative child. "Your sister should come live with us too," Grandma once suggested after a particularly awful visit, where Lindsay had stolen money from my wallet and tried to blame it on the mailman. Maybe if we raised her, she'd turn out different, but my parents refused. Lindsay was their baby, the child they could manage to parent, because frankly she demanded so little actual parenting. She'd learned early that tears and manipulation got her whatever she wanted. Why would they give that up? The truth was, my parents couldn't handle a kid who needed actual care and attention. That's why they dumped me on my grandparents in the first place. But Lindsay, she was easy. She entertained herself, demanded things instead of love, and never asked uncomfortable questions about where they disappeared to for weeks at a time. As my grandparents aged and their health declined, the family dynamic got increasingly tense. I was in college by then, splitting my time between classes and helping care for them. And that's when my parents' interest in the estate became less subtle and way more aggressive. Dad started calling constantly, asking pointed questions about their health, their will, their financial advisors. Mom would email links to retirement communities, subtly suggesting the house was too much for them to manage. Each visit became stressful, filled with hushed conversations that abruptly stopped the moment I walked into a room. Through all my school years, I excelled academically, fueled by my grandparents' unwavering support. While other kids got new phones or trendy clothes, my grandparents invested in books, museum memberships, educational trips. When I turned 16, I started working part-time at the local library to help with expenses. They insisted it wasn't necessary, but I saw how prescription costs and property taxes were straining their fixed income. My decision to study accounting was heavily influenced by something that happened in our neighborhood when I was a senior in high school. An elderly couple, the Hendersons, lost everything when their son convinced them to sign over power of attorney, then completely emptied their accounts. The helplessness, the utter betrayal they experienced, it haunted me. I knew then that I wanted to understand finances well enough to prevent that kind of injustice, especially for vulnerable seniors. College was incredibly challenging, while my grandparents' health declined fast. Grandpa developed serious heart problems requiring multiple surgeries. Grandma was diagnosed with early-stage dementia. I chose a local university so I could live at home and help care for them, turning down scholarships to fancier schools elsewhere. During my final year, I was taking classes all day, studying all night, and shuttling them to endless medical appointments in between. Grandpa had appointments with his cardiologist, his primary care doctor specialists for his kidney function. Grandma needed regular check-ins with her neurologist, plus various tests to monitor the progression of her dementia. I became expert at reading insurance forms, understanding medical jargon, advocating with doctors and nurses. I learned which medications couldn't be taken together, which symptoms required immediate attention, how to handle Grandma when she got confused and scared. It was utterly exhausting. I'd be up at 6 a.m. to help Grandpa with his morning medications and breakfast. Leave by 7:30 for my first class, come home at lunch to check on them. Head back for afternoon classes, then spend evenings cooking dinner, helping with evening medications, and studying late into the night. My social life was non-existent. Dating was impossible. Friends from class would invite me out and I'd have to decline because I needed to be home for medication schedules. But they had sacrificed so much for me. This was just what family does. This was what real love looks like. Showing up even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. The day I graduated from college was bittersweet. It was a beautiful spring morning in May, one of those perfect Philadelphia days where the temperature is just right and everything seems possible. Standing there in my cap and gown, scanning the audience from the staging area, I spotted Grandpa in his wheelchair oxygen tank humming beside him. Getting him to the ceremony had been a major undertaking. I'd rented a medical transport van coordinated with the university about wheelchair accessibility, arranged for portable oxygen, but he'd insisted on being there despite his doctor's concerns. Grandma sat next to him in her Sunday best, sometimes looking confused about where we were, but always smiling broadly when our eyes met. During the ceremony, I could see her asking Grandpa questions, probably wondering what we were doing here, and him patiently explaining over and over that their grandson was graduating. They had insisted on attending despite everything. Wild horses couldn't keep us away. Grandpa had declared that morning as I helped him with his tie, his hands too shaky to manage it himself. "We've been waiting for this day since you moved in with us." My parents and Lindsay nowhere to be seen again. They had received their invitations 4 months in advance. Fancy printed ones because graduation was important to me. Mom had RSVP, yes. Even asked what time to arrive. Lindsay had texted saying she wouldn't miss it for the world. The morning of graduation, Mom sent a text at 7 a.m. "Car trouble. Won't be able to make it. Congrats. Car trouble." Their standard excuse for missing things they didn't want to attend. I'd stopped believing their excuses around age 12. What hurt wasn't the absence itself. I'd grown used to that. It was the casual cruelty of it. The way they couldn't even be bothered to invent a creative lie. But you know what? When they called my name and I walked across that stage to receive my diploma, I looked out at the audience and saw Grandpa crying, actually crying, tears running down his weathered face. Grandma was clapping so enthusiastically that a nearby usher had to gently remind her to keep it down. After the ceremony, they waited while I took photos with classmates. Then Grandpa struggled to his feet. He insisted on standing even though it clearly hurt and pulled me into a hug. "Your grandmother and I are so proud of you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're going to do great things, Tyler." "Great things," Grandma added in one of her clearer moments. "Your degree says accounting, but your heart says justice. Don't ever lose that." We went to dinner at their favorite restaurant, this little Italian place they'd been going to since the 1970s. The owner knew them, gave us the best table, and nobody rushed us even though we stayed for 3 hours. We talked about everything. My job prospects, their health memories from my childhood. It was perfect. That night, helping Grandpa into bed, he said something that stuck with me. "Your parents don't know what they're missing. Their loss is immense and they don't even realize it." 3 weeks after graduation, Grandpa Frank passed away in his sleep. I'd been in the room down the hall working on a job application when I realized I hadn't heard his usual 3 a.m. trip to the bathroom. Something felt wrong. I went to check and found him peaceful, like he'd just dozed off while reading. The book he'd been reading, a biography of Theodore Roosevelt, was still open on his chest. The doctor said it was his heart, that he'd probably felt nothing, that it was as peaceful a death as anyone could hope for. But peaceful doesn't make it hurt less. Doesn't fill the sudden void of realizing you'll never have another conversation with someone who shaped your entire life. I sat with him for an hour before calling anyone, just holding his hand, saying goodbye, thanking him for everything. Grandma Dorothy followed exactly 6 months later. The doctors said it was pneumonia, but I knew better. She'd lost her partner of 54 years, her anchor, her everything. The dementia had been progressing rapidly since Grandpa died, like losing him accelerated her decline. Some days she didn't remember me. Other days she'd call me Frank and have whole conversations with me as if I were her husband. Her last clear day, about a week before she died. She grabbed my hand with surprising strength and looked at me with perfect lucidity. "Tyler," she said, not confused, not uncertain, but absolutely clear. "You are our greatest accomplishment. Not the house, not the properties, not anything else. You, the man you've become." Then she smiled. "Frank and I, we made sure everything is protected. Your parents can't touch it. You don't have to worry about that. Just promise me you'll be happy. Promise me you'll find people who love you the way we do." I promised through tears. She died peacefully in her sleep 3 days before Thanksgiving, with me holding her hand and reading aloud from her favorite mystery novel. I'd like to think she heard me, that she wasn't afraid, that she knew she was loved right up to the end. Standing at her bedside as she took her final breath, holding her frail hand, I made a silent promise to protect everything they'd built, everything they'd taught me, everything they'd sacrificed to give me a better life than their own son had managed. The funeral was surreal. My parents and Lindsay suddenly appeared. Dressed in expensive black clothes, I knew they couldn't afford playing the role of grieving family members. They were particularly attentive to elderly relatives and neighbors, collecting business cards from my grandparents' estate attorney and financial advisor, like they were networking at a conference. Dad kept asking when the reading of the will would happen, like we were in some old movie. What they didn't know was that I'd already been working behind the scenes for months. You see, about a year before Grandpa passed, during one of his lucid moments between hospital visits, he'd pulled me aside. "Tyler," he said, gripping my hand with surprising strength, "I know what your parents are like. I'm not a fool. Your grandmother and I have been watching them circle like sharks for years." He'd paused, taking a labored breath. "We're putting everything in a trust with you as the trustee. It's the only way to protect what we've built. But you need to be smart about this. Don't tell anyone until it's absolutely necessary." Working with their estate attorney, a sharp woman named Nancy Crawford, who'd known my grandparents for decades, we'd created an ironclad trust. Everything, the Victorian house, the 3 rental properties, the investment accounts, all of it went into the Frank and Dorothy Bennett Family Trust. I was named the sole trustee with complete discretion over all assets. My parents and Lindsay weren't mentioned anywhere in the documents. Nancy had been meticulous. "Your grandparents were very clear about their wishes," she told me during one planning session. "They wanted to ensure you were protected and that their legacy wasn't squandered by people who'd never appreciated them." After the funeral, there was indeed a meeting about the estate, but it wasn't the dramatic reading my parents had fantasized about. Nancy simply explained that all assets had been placed in a trust and that I was the trustee. She didn't elaborate on the trust's terms or structure. The disappointment on my parents' faces was barely concealed, but they didn't make a scene. Not yet. Of course we understand, Dad had said smoothly. These things take time to sort out. We're here to support Tyler through this difficult transition. Translation. They were regrouping and planning their next move. For the first few months, I stayed in the Victorian house, surrounded by memories. I kept working at the accounting firm where I'd landed a position right after graduation managing estates and trusts for clients. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was helping other families navigate exactly what I was dealing with. My parents and Lindsay began what I can only describe as a campaign of pressure. They'd call constantly with helpful suggestions about selling the house since it was too much for one person, or cashing out the rental properties because the market is hot right now. Each suggestion, of course, conveniently involved them getting a share of the proceeds. Lindsay was particularly aggressive. She'd show up unannounced with her friends, giving them tours of her family home and talking about how she planned to renovate the kitchen once she officially moved in. The audacity was stunning. One afternoon, I came home to find her measuring windows for curtains. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Just planning ahead," she said brightly. "This place needs updating, and I have great ideas." "Lindsay, you don't live here." "Not yet," she replied with this knowing smile that made my blood boil. I started documenting everything, every phone call, every visit, every suggestion about selling assets. My friend Owen, who'd gone to law school and specialized in estate litigation, had told me, "Trust me, document everything. Text messages, emails, witnesses to conversations. If this goes sideways, you'll need proof." Owen turned out to be absolutely right. The real trouble started about 8 months after Grandma passed. I came home from work one evening to find my parents sitting in the living room with a man in a cheap suit who introduced himself as a notary. Dad stood up with this triumphant expression. "Tyler, we've been patient, but it's time to face reality," he announced. "This house is too much for you to handle alone. Your mother and I have decided to take over the primary residence while you focus on your career. We've prepared the paperwork to transfer the title to our names. We just need your signature as trustee to approve the transfer." The sheer boldness of it left me momentarily speechless. They'd brought a notary to my house without warning, expecting me to just sign over a multi-million-dollar property because they'd decided it was best. "This is my home," I said quietly, "and I'm not signing anything." Mom's face crumpled into tears, her signature move. "How can you be so selfish? We're your parents. After everything we've done for you, what have you done for me?" The question came out sharper than I intended, but I was done pretending. "You dropped me off here when I was 5 and barely visited. Grandpa and Grandma raised me. They paid for my education, took care of me when I was sick, showed up for every important moment. Where were you chasing your next big scheme?" Dad's face red. "We're still your parents and we have rights. This house belonged to my father, which means it should pass to me, not to some grandkid who got lucky with a trust." "Grandpa knew exactly what he was doing when he created that trust," I replied. "Now please leave, all of you." They left, but not before Dad promised, "This isn't over. You'll regret this." The next few weeks were tense. My parents hired some budget attorney who sent threatening letters about challenging the trust and undue influence. Nancy laughed when she saw them. "These are empty threats," she assured me. "The trust was properly executed. Your grandparents were of sound mind, and you have documentation of their intentions. They're bluffing." But I knew my parents weren't done. They were just changing tactics. Then came last week, the week that proved just how low they'd sink. I'd taken a few days off work to visit Owen upstate for his birthday. When I came back Friday afternoon, I found my parents and Lindsay standing on my porch with the smug I'd ever seen. Tyler, Mom called out cheerfully, "We're so glad you're home. We need to talk." Something about their confidence immediately put me on alert. They weren't nervous or angry. They were triumphant. "We've had the house signed over to our names," Dad announced without preamble. "Everything's been transferred. We spoke with the county recorder's office, filed all the necessary documents. You have until Friday to move out. We're being generous, giving you 5 days." My heart stopped. "What are you talking about?" Lindsay pulled out a folder with official-looking documents. "We found a sympathetic judge who understood that the trust was invalid due to undue influence. The house has been transferred to Dad's name as the rightful heir. It's all legal and final." I stared at the paper she was waving, my mind racing. "Let me see those." "No need," Dad said, pulling the folder back. "You'll get copies when you move out. We're being very reasonable about this. You can take your personal belongings, but all furniture and fixtures stay. They belong to the house." "This is insane," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You can't just forge documents and steal someone's house." "Forge?" Mom gasped, hand to her chest. How dare you? Everything was done legally. The county has records. We filed everything properly. They weren't lying about filing documents. I could see genuine confidence in their faces. They'd actually gone to the county and filed something. The question was, what had they filed and how had they managed it? I'm calling Nancy, I said, pulling out my phone. Go ahead, Dad replied. She'll tell you the same thing. The house is ours now. Friday, Tyler be out by Friday. They left and I immediately called Nancy. She was shocked but not panicked. They can file whatever they want, she explained. That doesn't make it valid. I need to see exactly what they filed. Can you go to the county recorder's office Monday morning and get copies? That weekend was one of the longest of my life. I barely slept running through scenarios trying to figure out their angle. Owen drove down Saturday to help me think through possibilities. They must have forged something he said pacing my living room. Maybe they created fake documents showing you signed over your trustee powers, or forged your grandparents' signatures on a deed transfer. Either way, it's fraud. Monday morning, I was at the county recorder's office when they opened. The clerk pulled up the records, and sure enough, there was a new filing from the previous week. A quitclaim deed transferring the property from the trust to Gerald Bennett, signed by me as trustee. Except I'd never signed anything. The signature wasn't even close to mine. This is forgery, I told the clerk, who looked uncomfortable. I can't make that determination, sir, she replied. You'll need to file a challenge through the courts. I got copies of everything and immediately sent them to Nancy and Owen. NY's response was swift. They've committed several felonies: forgery, fraud, possibly conspiracy. We need to act fast. Tuesday morning, Nancy filed an emergency motion to void the fraudulent deed and scheduled a hearing for Thursday. She also contacted the district attorney's office about potential criminal charges. Meanwhile, I gathered every piece of evidence I had. The original trust documents with my genuine signature for comparison bank records showing I'd never deposited any money from a supposed property sale, and testimony from my neighbors who could confirm I'd been living continuously in the house. Owen helped me review everything. The beautiful thing about forgery is that it's usually pretty easy to prove, he said. Handwriting analysis, lack of notarization records no money trail. They were idiots to try this. Wednesday evening, I got a call from Dad. Tyler, we're coming by tomorrow with movers. Be packed and ready. We're being generous, letting you say goodbye to the old place. Tomorrow's not going to go the way you think, I replied. Empty threats, he scoffed. We've already talked to a moving company. Everything's arranged. I didn't argue. Just told him I'd see them tomorrow and hung up. Thursday morning arrived. I was awake at dawn, adrenaline coursing through my system. Owen arrived early along with Nancy. We sat in the living room drinking coffee and waiting. At exactly 9 a.m., a moving truck pulled up. My parents and Lindsay emerged from Dad's car, still wearing those smug expressions. Behind them were three movers looking confused about why they were at a house where someone was clearly still living. I stepped onto the porch. Owen and Nancy flanked me, both carrying briefcases. Dad's smile faltered when he saw the lawyers. What's this? This, Nancy said crisply, is me informing you that you've committed multiple felonies and there are currently police officers on their way to discuss your attempted fraud. Mom's face went pale. This is ridiculous. We filed everything legally. You filed a forged document, Owen explained, holding up the papers. This signature isn't Tyler's. The notary stamp is fake. There's no record of any money changing hands. You literally forged his signature on a quitclaim deed and tried to steal a $2 million house. Lindsay, who'd been so confident, suddenly looked like she might throw up. Dad, you said this would work. You said the lawyer told you it was legal. What lawyer? I asked. Because Nancy here is the actual estate attorney and she certainly didn't help you commit fraud. That's when Dad's mask finally cracked. You ungrateful piece of work. We're your parents. This house should be ours. Your grandfather was my father, and he chose to leave everything to Tyler because he knew exactly what you are. Nancy interjected. Now you can leave voluntarily, or you can explain yourselves to the police. As if on cue, two police cruisers pulled up. The officers I'd worked with when filing the fraud report stepped out. I'd spent Tuesday afternoon at the station going through everything with them, and they'd been appropriately appalled by my parents' scheme. The movers, realizing they'd been caught up in something criminal, quickly got back in their truck and left. Can't blame them. What followed was beautiful chaos. The officers asked my parents to explain how they'd obtained the quitclaim deed. Dad tried to bluster about having legal right to his father's property. Mom started crying and saying they'd been advised the paperwork was legitimate. Lindsay just stood there looking shell-shocked, finally realizing the consequences of their actions. The officer asked to see their documentation. When Dad reluctantly handed over the folder, the officer examined it and shook his head. "Sir, this is clearly forged. The signature doesn't match the trust's signature on file. The notary stamp isn't registered with any notary in this county, and there's no record of this transfer being approved by the trust's attorney. But we filed it with the county," Mom protested. "Filing a fraudulent document is still fraud, ma'am," the officer replied. "You can file anything you want, but that doesn't make it legal." Right then, another car pulled up. Helen Martinez, the home care worker who'd been with my grandparents during their final years, stepped out. She'd heard about this situation through mutual friends and had offered to provide testimony about my grandparents' clear intentions and my parents' absence during their final years. "These people," Helen said, pointing at my parents, visited maybe 4 times in the last 2 years of Frank and Dorothy's lives, and every visit ended with them asking about money or property. Tyler was there every single day. He fed them, bathed them, managed their medications, held their hands when they were scared. Those wonderful people knew exactly what they were doing when they created that trust. Mom tried to interrupt, but Helen wasn't having it. She'd cared deeply for my grandparents and was clearly furious on their behalf. Dorothy told me once toward the end that her biggest fear was her son stealing from Tyler after she was gone. She said, "We have to protect our boy," and that's exactly what they did. The officers informed my parents they were being charged with attempted fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. They were read their rights and taken to the police station for processing. Lindsay, who was technically an accessory but hadn't signed anything herself, was told she'd likely be called as a witness. As they were led away, Dad turned back one last time. "You're dead to us. You hear me? Dead. I've been dead to you since I was 5, I replied quietly. "This is nothing new." After they left, I just stood there on the porch trying to process what had happened. Nancy put a hand on my shoulder. "You did the right thing. Your grandparents would be proud," Owen added. "And legally speaking, you're completely protected. That trust is ironclad, and now they've created a criminal record that will prevent any future challenges." Helen came up and gave me a hug. "Frank and Dorothy loved you so much. They talked about you constantly, how smart you were, how kind, how you were the only family that mattered to them. This house is yours because you earned it through love, not because you demanded it." The legal aftermath took several months. My parents were convicted of fraud and forgery. The evidence was overwhelming. They received probation and fines and were ordered to pay restitution for the legal fees they'd caused me. The judge was particularly harsh, noting that attempting to steal from their own son made it worse, not better. Lindsay was never formally charged, but was required to give a deposition about her role. Turns out she'd known about the forgery, but had convinced herself it was technically legal because Dad kept saying so. She apologized later in a brief email, but I didn't respond. Some bridges once burned aren't worth rebuilding. Living alone in the house my grandparents filled with warmth has been both comforting and painful. Every room holds memories. Grandpa reading in his favorite chair by the fireplace. Grandma humming in the kitchen as she prepared Sunday dinner. The two of them dancing slowly to old records when they thought I was studying upstairs. The silence was overwhelming at first. I found myself talking aloud to them, asking for guidance, or simply sharing my day. Sometimes I swear I can hear Grandpa's deep chuckle or catch the faint scent of Grandma's perfume. About 6 months after the confrontation, I made an important decision. Using a portion of the trust's assets, I established the Frank and Dorothy Bennett Scholarship Fund at my old university. It's dedicated to supporting students interested in accounting and financial protection for vulnerable populations. This felt right, a continuation of their generous spirits and a way to create something positive from our family's painful history. As for my parents, I've had no contact since that day on the porch. Sometimes I see their names in my email spam folder or notice a missed call from an unknown number. I've made peace with the likelihood we'll never have a healthy relationship. That acceptance, painful as it was to reach, has been incredibly liberating.